Thank you, Ellen, and good evening, everyone. I am truly delighted again to serve as moderator for what I know will be a truly thoughtful and insightful conversation with Brooke. Brooke Goldstein is a human rights attorney and award-winning filmmaker based in New York City. Brooke currently serves as director of the Lawfare Project, a nonprofit dedicated to raising awareness and facilitating response to the abuse of Western legal systems and human rights law. She's also the founder and director of the Children's Rights Institute, a nonprofit which tracks and combats the violation of children's human rights around the world. She produced and co-directed the award-winning documentary, The Making of a Martyr, and is a frequent commentator and analyst on American television and TV around the world. She was also recognized by the Jewish Week 7 years ago, at the age of 28 as an up-and-comer, and was named one of the Jewish Week's 36 under 36, the people to watch. So I'm going to start by sharing with you that we have a little bit in common. We are both born and bred Canadians, and we spent our 20s traveling throughout the West Bank and the Gaza Strip interviewing Palestinian suicide bombers. I'm sure there are not a lot of people who sit on this stage who can claim that, but I know how I got there. I'm curious, what drew you to these areas to do what you did?
Well, thank you, Linda. I also want to thank our hosts in the Jewish Week and Hadassah for having me here. It really is a huge honor to join the incredible people who are part of the Defining Zionism series. I think a safe space to talk about this topic, to talk about Zionism, which unfortunately has become a dirty word both in Jewish circles and not Jewish circles, is very much needed. So thank you for having me. I always get that question. How did you find yourself at 24 years old interviewing the Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigades? And it obviously wasn't a very straight and narrow path. I didn't wake up one morning and say, hey, this is what I want to do, put my life in danger. But I ended up there actually, second year of law school. I was studying to become an entertainment lawyer. I knew I wanted to be a lawyer from a very young age. I think it was because I was always told I was very argumentative, and that's what argumentative kids do. I was studying entertainment law. I went to the Benjamin and Cardozo School of Law, and they're known both for their intellectual property, but also their international law courses. And I had my internships at great companies. I worked for InStyle, I worked for Time Magazine, I worked for Court TV, I worked for a very small film production company called Stick Figure Productions, and I found that I was less drawn to the work of an entertainment lawyer, and I was more drawn towards the creative aspect of film and editing. And while it was so much fun to chase after people for image release agreements and to read Time magazine articles for potentially defamatory statements, I wanted instead to, do creative stuff. So my boss at Court TV said, well, he was kind enough to allow me to sit in the editing room of their studios, and I really loved film. So I decided, maybe this wasn't for me, and my second year of law school, I decided to switch my concentration to international law, and I happened to be taking a class called Human Rights and the Child, and I came home one day, and I turned on the TV, and I was doing my homework at the same time. And broadcast before me was an image of a 15-year-old physically handicapped, rumored to be mentally handicapped, Palestinian Arab boy named Hussam Abdu with live explosives strapped around his waist. This was in 2004. at the Hawara checkpoint, and he had his hands in the air, and he was, turning around before the cameras before they sent in an electronic robot arm to cut off his suicide belt. And it turned out that just 48 hours before, Hussam had been recruited by the Palestinian Arab terrorist group, the Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigades. He was paid the equivalent of $20. He was told not to tell his parents where he was going. He was filmed for a farewell video, a martyrs video, which is the custom of suicide homicide bombers. His picture was taken to be printed for a poster which would be celebrating his death after he chose to blow himself up. And he was driven by the Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigades to a checkpoint just outside of Nablus, and he was told to blow himself up amongst the Palestinians waiting online to get into Israel. And the story goes that fortunately for Hussam, and fortunately for those who were waiting online, he proved smarter than the adults who recruited him because he chose life. He chickened out. He decided to give himself up, and he was subsequently arrested. He was tried and convicted of attempted murder, and he was sentenced to 8 years in the Hasharon prison, which is about, 40 minutes outside of Jerusalem. So at that point, as a law student taking this class, it occurred to me that there was a legal argument here that was not being made by the media, it was not being made by politicians, or obviously by his legal defense team, which is that the child suicide bomber, just like the child soldier, just like the child human shield, is as much a victim of a human rights abuse as are the innocent civilians killed in his or her wake, because especially in the Palestinian Arab context, the children are literally from infancy targeted, and they're recruited through their television, their textbooks, their radio programs, and so on. So I decided that this was something I wanted to write my thesis on, and then I ended up raising about $250,000, mostly from family and friends, traveling to Jenin, Ramallah, Tulkarm, and Nablus, and securing interviews with leaders of terrorist organizations, families of suicide bombers. I went to Israeli prisons, interviewed children who had attempted to blow themselves up or who were otherwise caught attempting to participate in violent activities. And I did it because I wanted to capture this issue. I wanted to capture from the mouths of the victims themselves on camera and the perpetrators this crime, this egregious human rights violation that is widespread, occurring against Muslim children throughout the Muslim majority world, and that nobody was paying attention to, which I believe to be the root cause of terrorism.
And who did you say you were representing?
So I was very honest. I said I was a Canadian, my name is Brooke, and I'm making a film about the abuse of Palestinian children. And they just assumed I was going to make an anti-Israel propaganda film. But I was making a film about the abuse of Palestinian children at the hands of the Palestinian Authority and Islamist terrorist groups.
So then the obvious question is, what was the reaction once they saw
They
the
did
film?
not ask. Oh, well, so I did not distribute my film in Nablus and Ramallah. I know that my film was screened for Hussam when he was released out of prison, and the fixer that I worked with told me that he had no idea that, obviously he knew that he was being filmed, but he had no idea that the film itself would be as successful, relatively speaking, for a documentary film as it was. And, it kind of plays into the whole notion of martyrdom. A lot of people ask me, why do children, or why does the suicide homicide bomber blow him or herself up? It's not out of desperation. Hussam Abdu, for example, and a lot of the suicide homicide bombers come from middle-class families, and they're not doing it for the money. He wasn't doing it for the $20. They're doing it not out of desperation, but aspiration to be famous, aspiration to have a square named after you, a soccer team named after you. The Palestinian Authority does music videos where they depict the suicide bomber as a hero to be emulated. And when we interviewed young children, we asked them, what do they want to be when they grow up? And they said, Shaheed, a martyr. And when we pressed them further, it was also because of what the notion of paradise was that was sold to them. They would describe to us in detail what heaven would look like. One child said he wanted to build a 5-story home of white marble and invite all of his family, and there'd be a Ferris wheel outside and so on. So the kids did not understand that when you strap a bomb to your body and blow yourself up and blow your limbs to pieces, you die. They don't understand that concept. They think they're going to be rewarded in heaven.
So you went to law school thinking that you were going to be an entertainment lawyer, and you went to Ramallah and Nablus, leaving wanting to be a human rights attorney. Is that what led you on this path?
Right. And then, so what really got me to the point of running a litigation fund now, a pro-Israel legal fund, the only one in existence, and a legal think tank, is that everybody who was doing what I was doing, when I came back and I released my film and I went around the world to film festivals, I was very fortunate, and I started getting called up. I was invited to the White House, I was invited to the State Department, I got to brief US CENTCOM, because nobody understood why jihadis were blowing themselves up. Why did they want to kill us so much and kill themselves in the process? And everybody who was doing what I was doing started getting sued. They started, finding themselves on the receiving end of a frivolous libel lawsuit that's aimed to silence them and shut them up and intimidate them, or they found themselves being slandered as Islamophobes. And so I ended up being hired as in-house counsel to the Middle East Forum and working with Daniel Pipes, who is one of the most intelligent people I know when it comes to analyzing the Middle East and the Islamist world. And he set up, and I was privileged to run a legal fund, which financed the defense of people who were victimized by what we coined to be Islamist lawfare or libel lawfare, sued for exercising your First Amendment right to free speech on issues of national security. So I got into that, and then interrupt me if you want to, like I'm going on and on.
Well, I was going to ask you what are some of the examples of the cases that you've been involved in, and this Lawfare Project. I mean, what exactly is the relationship to Zionism?
Okay, so when I worked with Daniel Pipes, we financed mostly, and I'm sure the legal project at the Middle East Forum has evolved since now, and they're doing wonderful work. We financed mostly the defense of lawsuits. One of the people that we were involved with was Hassan Diol Islam, who was or is an Iranian American who fled Iran, fled because of the persecution there, has family there, and thought he could come to the United States and write and blog freely about NIAC, the National Iranian American Council, and Trita Parsi, who I'm sure you see on CNN all the time, pretending to be the representatives of Iranian Americans when in fact they behave as though they are the lobbying arm of the Iranian government. And Hassan Diol Islam wrote about them and blogged about them, and he ended up getting sued by NIAC. And so we found him pro bono counsel, and the legal project ended up financing his defense. And he won in the end, and NIAC got sanctioned for about $130,000 for attempting, I believe, to destroy evidence. And so now he can speak and write publicly about that stuff, but you can imagine the chilling effect that occurred on other bloggers and writers when the lawsuit was ongoing. So after I worked for Daniel Pipes for about 2.5 years, I ended up writing a book. It's here, it's available, called Lawfare, The War Against Free Speech. As a Canadian, I was very surprised by how many Americans were simply unaware of what the First Amendment was. And in an age and what it protects, where people are accused very often of being Islamophobic merely for talking about issues of theologically motivated terrorism, which we have every right to talk about. I would get phone calls, is criticizing Islam illegal? Can we talk about religion? Can I get sued for speaking the truth about so-and-so charity organization that's really a front for a Hamas terrorist group. And so I wrote a book, which reads a little bit more like a textbook, unfortunately. It's a primer on the First Amendment about what is protected speech and how to protect yourself from a predatory defamation attack. And then I heard a lecture by Malcolm Hoenlein, who is the CEO of the Conference of Presidents, and he really broadened my perspective on what this whole lawfare threat is all about. And perhaps I should define the term, because I've used it a bunch, right?
What exactly?
Right.
What is lawfare and what does it have to do with Zionism?
So lawfare is a term of art. It means simply the use of the law or the abuse of the law as a weapon of war. It's all about the manipulation of Western legal systems to undermine the very principles and the rights that they stand for. And lawfare is used against free speech, as we saw Nayak sued Hassan al-Islam. There's countless other examples that we could talk about. And Malcolm Hoenlein spoke about how the legal system was being used not just to silence our ability to speak about these issues, but as a tool and a strategy on the international level to delegitimize the sovereignty of democratic nations and to frustrate and hinder the ability of Western nations, especially Israel, to engage on the battlefield in asymmetric warfare. And so we established this think tank called the Lawfare Project to study the issue. We were just a think tank when we were first established in 2010, and we have now morphed into the only pro-Israel legal fund, litigation fund in existence, and we provide pro bono counsel, and we finance both offensive and defensive litigation around the world.
So just as, well, Israel's enemies, I've often said, the battlefield is very different today, and it's been said that 20% of war is, only 20% of war is fought on the battlefield, 80% is fought over the airwaves and through social media, that Israel's enemies, Israel's detractors try to weaken Israel on the only court that they're capable of, the court of public opinion. But what you're doing and what you're saying is that that's happening in the international court system as well.
Exactly.
Okay, so how do you do, I mean, you're based in New York and you're fighting these battles internationally, I mean.
So, yeah, I mean, you touched basically on you know, hit the nail on the head here. Okay. The Israel's or the West's enemies cannot defeat, and they know they cannot defeat us on the battlefield. We are way more advanced than they are. That is why they resort to asymmetric warfare tactics, use children as human shields, play on the fact that democracies adhere to the rule of law and so on, and use that as our Achilles heel. You know, Hamas, for example, uses children as human shields, and then there are obviously civilian casualties. The laws of armed conflict are very clear that, you know, the party that intentionally puts civilians in harm's way is liable for the foreseeable result. Hamas hides rockets and launches rockets from children's schools and then runs to the ICC to try and get a prosecution against Israel for war crimes. This is lawfare. I mean, you have so many examples of lawfare in the international arena and international courts, European courts where they have universal jurisdiction. You have a total perversion of the international legal system. You have hundreds or over 100 resolutions against Israel at the United Nations. You know, there's not one General Assembly resolution condemning or defining the crime of terrorism, and that's because the Islamist bloc has lobbied against every single resolution that they attempted to pass because they want an exception. The crime of terrorism is one where you target civilians unless those civilians are of an occupying power, i.e. Americans or Israelis. They want to exempt the killing of Israelis and Americans from the definition of terrorism, and that won't fly. You have, you know, the International Court of Justice, the ICJ's advisory opinion in 2004 that attempted to paint Israel's security fence, brick mortar, and barbed wire as a violation of international law. Well, the same court refused to enter into evidence the very relevant fact that the fence contributed to a sharp decline in the loss of human lives, refused to hear the testimony of terror victims. You That's not due process, that's lawfare. When you have war crimes charges against Israeli officials in Spain, in Belgium, in Switzerland, in the Netherlands, in Canada, and Israeli officials can't cross international state lines, and yet Hamas and Hezbollah are free to cross European borders with impunity, that's lawfare.
Right. Turning to what you did in the making of the movie, you would describe yourself as an advocate for children, an advocate obviously for Western values, but because you are also the legal arm of the pro-Israel community, does that undermine your message in some way? Are you able to get your point across to audiences beyond this sanctuary?
Well, yeah, I think it makes the point. I think the point that I want to make is that being pro-Israel is being anti-terrorist. Being pro-Israel is being pro-human rights of Muslim children. I think that's exactly the point I want to make. And, we spoke about it earlier. A lot of people claim that talking about the theological motivations behind Islamist terrorists is Islamophobic. And so, the question that I ask them, if making a movie and risking my life to highlight the abuse against Palestinian children whose futures are undeniably linked to our future, if that's anti-Muslim, what then is pro-Muslim? I want them to answer that question. They never can. And I think on hindsight, the brilliance of the film is that it can actually form base consensus amongst people who would otherwise disagree. And a perfect example of that is when I screened the film at Cardozo, and I invited Alan Dershowitz, who was kind enough to come and to debate with, oh my God, this is pregnancy brain right here. Yeah. Hamid Dabashi, who is the professor of Iranian studies at Columbia University, who was Edward Said's protege, and who otherwise is politically abhorrent to me on the completely other side as I am. And we screened the film, and I said to him, do you think Muslim children deserve to be murdered? And he said no. And I said, well, do you think that Muslim children deserve to have bombs strapped around their waist and be blown up by remote control? And he said no. I said, well, do you think then a curriculum that teaches Muslim children to revere Shahada and revere death is right? And he said no. Well, do you think a Palestinian Authority that funds a curriculum that teaches children to kill themselves is legitimate? And so from this base consensus that Muslim children are innocent is the best human rights advocacy, because it's true, because truth is the safest ground to stand upon.
Thank you. Turning to this country and what's happening on many college campuses, and has been for quite a number of years. Many of us, as we all know, have been deeply frustrated by the intimidation and harassment of Jewish students in the pro-Israel community on campus. So when Israel's detractors wave the flag of the First Amendment, what can you do legally to stop this?
Okay, so Israel's detractors are very good at one thing. They're very good at something called the mirror effect. They accuse us of what they are guilty of. There's a great book called The 48 Laws of Power by Robert Greene. I recommend it. It goes into the mirror effect, and it's quite genius. They accuse us of violating their First Amendment rights, and yet they shout down and scream at anyone who has an opposing point of view. Case in point, I just testified before the New York City Council, and people were interrupting not just my testimony, but the testimony of other people who were testifying for an anti-BDS resolution, yelling and screaming like crazy people and holding signs that say free speech. I mean, the irony to that. They victimize Jewish students on campus. Jewish students are getting beaten up on American college campuses. We represented a student at Temple University who was punched in the face by an SJP associate. We talk to students almost every week who call us for pro bono legal services, who tell us that they cannot be a Zionist on campus. They are too afraid to wear a Star of David on campus. They victimize Jews on campus, harass Jews on campus, and they claim their civil rights are being violated. They accuse Israel of genocide, and yet they support Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, who are genocidal entities calling for the destruction of the Jewish state. So when you look at college campuses, there are rampant First Amendment violations. There are rampant Title VI violations. Any school that receives government funding has an obligation to prevent and to cure a pervasive hostile environment that targets students based on protected categories such as religion, ethnicity, race and gender, and so on.
But Brooke, have there ever been any examples of a successful case that's been made against a university based on everything that you just described?
We've had a lot of success. I mean, so when you look at how a lawyer operates, the last thing you want to do is you want to get to a court of law and argue a case. You know, before that you want to settle the case, before that you want to mediate, and way before that you want to equip a potential plaintiff with a lawyer and you want to negotiate a solution with the school. So we've worked in many cases and had a lot of successes. For example, at Rutgers University, we worked together with the Hillel there, run by Andrew Guttrer, when we found out that U.S. to Gaza and Baca and Code Pink were fundraising for the anti-Israel, pro-Hamas flotilla movement. And the flotilla movement was stupid enough to advertise that they were engaging material support for a designated terrorist group. How? They were arranging docking of the boat with Hamas, a designated terrorist group. They were dumb enough to post online a picture of a certificate they received from Hamas thanking them for their support. So we wrote a very nice letter, a very long letter with the help of my team, Benjamin Ryberg and Amanda Berman, who are here today somewhere. And we told the president of Rutgers that we don't care what you think of Israel, but if you released thousands of dollars that you raised today on campus, you can find yourself in jail for 20 years, and you could potentially be sued by groups like us for material support for terrorism. And lo and behold, they did not release the money. You know, we consult with students all the time. We had a student at Boston University who was harassed for his pro-Israel speech in class. He was denied testing, special testing accommodations that he was entitled to under the school. We worked very nicely with him and the administration. The professor does not work at that school for some reason anymore, and he was given his testing accommodations. And then obviously there's ongoing cases. The Jewish Week was kind enough to cover the case that we came on board. We're co-counsel with an incredible attorney named Corey Stark, and we represent Professor Jeffrey Lax at the Kingsborough campus of CUNY, and we're suing CUNY right now for the rampant discrimination and anti-Semitism and workplace harassment that's happening on that campus, and I know that suit will be successful.
Is there any advice that you'd give a college freshman as they prepare to become involved in either in the pro-Israel community or within or on campus in a college classroom? I mean, what advice would you give a college freshman today? So my advice would be to avail yourself of the services that the Lawfare Project offers. It's a Know Your Rights pamphlet. And it's very simple. If this happens, then these are your rights. If our kids don't know what their rights are, they won't be able to identify when their basic civil rights are being violated. And when they identify that happening, they should get in touch with the lawyer. The second piece of advice I have is that we are playing defense, and we cannot any longer do that. Defensive pro-Israel advocacy is a losing argument. We have to go on the offense. And going on the offense has to also do with not using the terminology of the other side, because that terminology, if we continue to use it, is a losing argument. For example, there is no Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We have to stop repeating that. There is a conflict between
Islamist terrorists and Western democracies. The conflict between Hamas and the Israeli citizens is an Iranian proxy war. Hamas takes its money, they take their direction from Iran, they take their direction from Qatar. There is no such thing as an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There is no such thing as a cycle of violence. There is a predictable pattern of violence where terrorist groups indoctrinate their children, they incite against Jews, they incite against infidels, they engage in terrorist attacks, Israelis respond, there are civilian casualties, everything dies down, and it happens again. There is no Palestinian Arab nationality. We have to stop repeating that, no matter how politically incorrect it is. Students today are not versed in history. Their brains don't go back before 1981. They don't know that the Palestinian Arab nationality was invented by Arafat in the 60s purely as a lawfare tactic to claim parity with the Jewish state. I mean, you just ask yourself, did Israel capture Palestine in 67, or did they capture the West Bank from Jordan and Gaza from Egypt? Did the Allied nations win World War II against Palestine, or did they capture the Ottoman Empire and then via Sykes-Picot Agreement divide up the Ottoman Empire? Every single border line drawn in the Middle East besides Israel is fake. And Israel is the only borderline that will survive what is the so-called Arab Spring, which is really an Arab winter. So do not speak the terminology of your enemies, because that is a losing argument, no matter how politically incorrect that is.
Okay, so I'm going... So I was going to say that there are certainly people in this audience who agree with everything that you have just said. But as you know, there are many people outside this room and perhaps even inside this room who see the conflict in very different terms, who do believe that there is a Palestinian-Israeli conflict or an Arab-Israeli conflict, who are not wholly supportive of everything that the Israeli government does, every piece of its policy. And we know, particularly amongst millennials, that there's tremendous division, tremendous conflict, a shallow understanding of history for sure, but the young people see it very differently. Many of them see it very differently than you do. So I guess my question is, and I have to make that argument, but my question is, are there people out there who really see your tactics and your approach as just being simply too aggressive?
I take that as a compliment. I never understood why people said, wow, you're really aggressively pursuing your civil rights. How is that not a compliment? I don't understand how you could not aggressively pursue your civil rights. I mean, if we don't do it, if we don't speak the truth, then no one's going to speak it for us. And the message that we send to SJP or anti-Israel or anti-Semitic groups on campus when we see them beating up our Jewish students, and we say, Israel's a democracy, Israel has great beaches. The message we send them when we don't go after them in a court of law and we don't make sure they're held accountable is that we're feckless. And they can continue to mess with us, and their tactics are successful, and that does not engender self-respect. I think people only respect you if you respect yourself. So to me, one of the reasons why we established a legal fund is because we saw so much money and resources, millions of dollars, going into pro-Israel advocacy, and there were no lawyers to make sure the pro-Israel events that they just spent $5,000 on isn't going to get shut down. Or the speaker from Israel that they just paid a $2,000 LL ticket for and signed a contract isn't going to get boycotted. What's going to happen with the breach of contract issue? I mean, there are no lawyers equipping these students and the pro-Israel advocacy groups to enable that they can actually accomplish their missions. You wouldn't build a building with just an architect. You would hire a whole team, including a lawyer, who would probably be really helpful when it comes to getting the permits or, writing up the leases and getting indemnification and writing up your insurance policy. So the fact that there are no lawyers attached to pro-Israel advocacy groups, to me, was a huge hole that we had to fill. And if that is called being aggressive, then again, so be it.
Okay. Before I start taking some of your questions, I know they are being read as I speak. Talk to me a little bit about what you see as the looming threats in the area of lawfare, both on campus and off.
Okay. So the looming threats that I see, obviously, is violence. We are seeing violence occurring on select campuses. They are watching us. They are watching how we react to violence occurring against our children, and they are learning. And again, if we don't do something as a legal community to hold those who engage in criminal activity accountable, the looming threat is further criminal activity. I also see the threat in the international arena, specifically at the ICC, the International Criminal Court, which seems to be set on tailor-making some sort of bespoke prosecution of Jews for building homes in Judea and Samaria. I want to make it very clear that Jews, like any other religious group, have every right to live wherever they want. And those who say that settlements are an obstacle to peace, I believe, are propagating the racist proposition that any future Palestinian Arab state, if there should be one, should be Jude Rhine. That is what you mean when you say settlements are an obstacle to peace, that Jews living in a future Palestinian state are an obstacle to that functioning of that state. That is racist. So the ICC prosecution or attempted prosecution of Jews for living in their homeland in Judea and Samaria, I see that as a looming threat, especially when they've decided to completely ignore very real, ongoing occupations in total violation of the Geneva Convention. Turkey, for example, and Cyprus, and you have Morocco and the Northern Sahara, you have Russia and Crimea. And the world needs to understand that one of the great things about the legal system is that you create precedents. When you have a legal decision, that decision can and will be used by lawyers to enforce that decision in other similar circumstances. And I think that the international community really doesn't understand that, because they try to create these unique situations where they prosecute Israel, for example, or they attempt to on the battlefield, but coalition forces are using the same techniques as well. So if Israelis go down for this, so will coalition forces.
As you know, there are many Israelis who would disagree with what you say, and who may agree that Israel has the right to settle these territories, that Jews have the right to live wherever they want to live, but that it's not the wise decision, and that much of what is happening today in terms of Israeli government policy is creating more work for you, frankly, is leading to greater isolation and greater challenges on the college campus, and provides much of the impetus for your work. What would you say?
So, yeah, I mean, lots of people could disagree with me. They're free to. And it kind of reminds me of an event we actually had today with a Palestinian Arab named Bassam Aid. And I said to him, what do you think of the BDS movement? And he's like, none of my Arab friends support the BDS movement. We all economically rely on Israeli companies, and we're certainly not talking about the great pro-Palestinian advocate at Boston University. I mean, we don't find these people heroes. So a lot of Palestinians, Arabs, disagree with the so-called pro-Palestinian movement. And I asked him also, what do you consider your nationality? I think that Palestinian nationality is invented. It's a fact. And he goes, yeah, I got a Jordanian passport. My family comes from Saudi Arabia. Arafat was born in Egypt. I mean, these are truths that are accepted in the area that we're so focused on talking about all the time here in the West. And yet in the West, we Jews like to disagree, and the pro-Palestinian movement seems way off base when it comes to advocating for the people that they claim to represent, which they don't.
I'm going to ask you to define Zionism. What is your definition of Zionism, Brooke?
So to me, it's very simple. Zionism is the Jewish civil rights movement. It's as legitimate as any other civil rights movement. It, in fact, has informed many other civil rights movements, including the Black civil rights movement, the Kurdish civil rights movement, for example. And it is an expression of self-sovereignty, of the basic, inalienable human right to govern yourself. And it means that Jews have the right to live in Israel and govern themselves. And I am a proud Zionist, and anyone who is anti-Zionist or says I'm an anti-Zionist is an anti-Semite, because what you're saying is that you don't believe that Jews have the right to self-sovereignty.
Where does your Zionism come from? How was that forged?
So, it's a combination, I believe, of my family's history, having Holocaust surviving grandparents, understanding the necessity of self-sovereignty. My first trip to Israel was actually the second part of a two-part trip on March of the Living. When I was 16 years old, I went on this incredible trip, for those who aren't familiar, where Jewish high school students from all over the world are taken to visit concentration camps in Poland. We went to Majdanek, we went to Treblinka, or what's left of it, we went to Auschwitz and Birkenau, understanding the necessity of the state of Israel, but also because there is a love that I have for my people. And the feeling that you have when you land in Tel Aviv with the history that the Jewish people have is indescribable. I mean, how can I possibly describe in words the feeling that I get when I land in Israel and you're surrounded by fellow Jews, by your people, and it's nothing to be ashamed of. And I love Israel because they have great clubs and okay beaches.
So then I'm going to follow that up with a question from the audience, which asks or states that there are many Jewish college students today who ask their parents, why should a Jewish state exist? Isn't it exclusionary? What other country is so identified with a religion like Israel is with Judaism?
Every Muslim country. You know, why is it that we only ask why a Jewish state should exist? Does the same child says, why should Saudi Arabia exist? I don't like how they treat women. Why on earth should Iran exist? Why does China exist? I think the question in and of itself, you know, again, I wouldn't play into that. I think that it betrays a certain ignorance and a prejudice, and I would ask that child, sort of, I guess, akin to what you ask the kids on Passover, why should you exist?
Well, I mean, it certainly plays to the conflict and the tension that I think many young people feel between a Jewish state and a democratic state. I mean, I think that question speaks to
Judaism
those.
invented democracy. They need to go study the Talmud. The only reason I passed the LSAT is because I studied Talmud in school. Look, you got to read the Founding Fathers. They clearly don't understand the definition of democracy. I also find, and I think it sort of plays into this sort of line of questioning of a complete misunderstanding of cause and effect. You know, Israel and its existence creates a problem. You know, that's the same thing that we saw when it came to, for example, the Muhammad cartoons. Or the so-called YouTube video that caused Benghazi 3,000 miles away. And there's a total lack of understanding of the concept of cause and effect. Somebody who writes an article or pens a cartoon does not cause the violence. The imam preaching violence as a legitimate response to your hurt feelings is the cause of the violence. Israel's existence, the existence of the Jew, is not what causes the problems in the world. It's those who preach the Jew as a problem, as a legitimate target, at those who dehumanize the Jew, which Sharia law does. I'm doing an article that's coming out in Tablet magazine comparing the Nuremberg laws. The 70th anniversary of the Nuremberg trial came, and I was in Poland as an alum of March of the Living, and I did a study on a comparison of how the Nuremberg laws, how the judiciary and the legal system was used to dehumanize the Jew as a necessary prerequisite for genocide. And the dehumanization of the other, of the kafir, of the infidel, that you see not just in Sharia law, but you see prevalent in the media of every single Muslim majority country that exists today. In Nilesat, which is Egypt-based satellite program, Eutelsat, French-based even, Arabsat, Saudi Arabia-based, have all broadcast Hamas TV. We had here in the United States, Nilesat IPTV, a company based, I think it was in New Jersey, illegally broadcasting Hamas's Al-Aqsa TV and Hezbollah's Al-Manar network, and the Lawfare Project worked with law enforcement to shut that down. That is the cause of Islamist terrorism. That is the cause of the conflict that we know is not just in the Middle East anymore, but is coming here because of the radicalization through the media.
You have been dealing with the situation at CUNY, and there's a questioner who wants to know why students at CUNY, or specifically Hunter or other universities where there has been a lot of detractor activity, some of it that may be coming from students who are here on student visas. Why has there been no action on the issue of foreign students violating their visas with anti-Semitic political action? Why is this not being addressed? I mean, have you attempted to?
That we have not looked into that. I don't know about the veracity of those comments. It's something that I would like to look into. I know that people, including anti-Semitic speakers, have come into this country potentially in violation of their visas. That's something that we have looked into. I haven't looked into the student issue, but I think when we look at campuses, what's important to know is that these are not grassroots civil rights movements that spontaneously erupt from well-meaning children. These are well-organized, orchestrated, top-down student movements that receive the direction from organizations that have also been linked and people that have been linked to funding designated terrorist groups. And I know that the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and Jonathan Scherzer recently did a testimony. I encourage everybody to read it, exploring anti-Israel groups. I believe it was about SJP, but I'm not sure, being connected to people that have also funded terror front organizations.
Is BDS using tactics that are actually illegal?
Yeah, well, they certainly advocate illegal tactics. We have to be very careful to make the distinction between advocacy and commercial activity. In this country, you are free to be a bigot. You can say mostly whatever you want as long as it's not defamatory and incitement to immediate violence or falls under the category of obscenity, such as child pornography and so on. There are exceptions to the First Amendment. But when it comes to being a racist and a bigot and having offensive speech, that is protected. The famous Supreme Court decision, Terminello, versus City of Chicago, said that even the most offensive speech should be deserved of the highest protection, and I agree, because that is what invites dispute and debate. So they do advocate tactics that are illegal, however. And when we look at the BDS movement, we also have to understand, again, it's not this spontaneous grassroots movement that just started like 5 years ago. The Arab League is what initiated what then morphed into the modern day BDS movement, and they did so before 48. It has nothing to do with the state of Israel. It has to do with boycotting Jews. And the Arab League mandated that every Muslim state and Muslim person must boycott not only Jews and their businesses, but anyone who did business with Jews. And in the 70s, the United States government enacted the Export Administration Act, which has then lapsed but then been reenacted by every president via executive order, which makes it unlawful to cooperate with the Arab League boycott. On top of that, we have different state laws. We have New York State anti-discrimination laws. We have California anti-discrimination laws. We have public accommodation laws, for example. Just like you cannot have a bar and say no blacks allowed, or you cannot open up a restaurant and say no Chinese people allowed here, so too can you not have a food co-op and say no Israelis or no Israeli products here. There are anti-discrimination laws in several states that make it unlawful to engage in commercial conduct in which you discriminate against a person or a company because of protected categories, which include national origin. There's also now a trend that states are passing laws that prevent state pension funds and state contracts towards going to companies, I do believe also that advocate boycotts, and that is not a First Amendment issue because the state is not under any obligation to spend its money. A government cannot suppress free speech, but they are not obligated to spend their money on projects that they disagree with. And soon, hopefully, there will be a federal anti-discrimination statute reenacting the Export Administration Law and hopefully allowing for a private right of action for people who are discriminated against in this context. And so the Lawfare Project, we created a memo that we distributed that analyzes US law and also analyzes EU law. We did the same thing in Europe. They have incredible anti-discrimination laws. Sometimes they go a little bit too far, but BDS is completely illegal, and we are now empowering lawyers in different jurisdictions, for example, in Spain, to use the anti-discrimination laws against the BDS movement, and they've been very successful there. So we created this memo analyzing the laws, and we have distributed the memo to companies that have been targeted by the BDS movement, distributed it to the in-house counsel, warning them of the liability that would ensue, and we have defeated the BDS movement multiple times that way.
And you had a success with Kuwaiti Airlines.
Right, Kuwait Airways, huge success. So Kuwait Airways operated a flight from JFK to London, and they refused to carry Israeli citizens, Israeli passport holders. And they were doing so in violation of the Open Skies Agreement. They were doing so in violation of the Export Administration Act, in violation of civil rights law, in violation of the Airline Deregulation Act, and in violation of their lease with Port Authority. And they were doing so for over a decade. And again, why the Jewish community never thought of hiring a lawyer to look this up, until just recently, for some, eludes me. But we did a study into it, and there was also a lawsuit that was filed by a great attorney, Jeff Levitke, on behalf of a client, Eldad Gott, and we worked with him, and we worked together with the Port Authority, which eventually delivered a letter to Kuwait Airways saying that if they don't comply with the law, that they're in violation of their lease, and lo and behold, Kuwait Airways canceled its flight. So we did the same in Europe. We have counsel in several different European countries. We've gone after Kuwait Airways there, and we've completely shut down the inter-European leg of Kuwait Airways, and the message is there's an economic price to pay for discriminating against Jews. So it's sort of the opposite of the Arab League boycott.
I'm going to end it there. I'm going to thank you for tackling some very big issues. And again, to you, Brooke, for being here tonight and for the work that you have.
Thank you, Linda. I appreciate it.
We would would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.